think. Today we're going to be discussing Chapter 3 of The Defense Never Rests, written by William Lane Craig and Joseph Tang. So if you're following along with us out there in Facebook land, turn to page 14 of your workbooks. You don't need a workbook. You can take notes or just follow along and listen, but it's good to have you here. I'm in a room with my friends, many of whom are youth pastors, and so we're just going through some of the different arguments and apologetics. The last few weeks we kind of set the stage and discussed how we should think about evidence and got into some epistemology, things like that. And today we're going to start our first official argument, our first official logical argument that we will use for the sake of apologetics, which is explaining why Christianity is true. You're an apologist if you defend something. Apologia, the original Greek word, just means a defense. And so whenever you defend a worldview or anything else, you're an apologist for that thing. So you have apologists in sports. You've got your LeBron James apologists who argue that he's the best of all time. Then your Michael Jordan apologists that say, no, Michael Jordan is. As soon as you take a position and defend it, congratulations, you're an apologist. So you even have atheistic apologists. So often I have conversations with atheists and they're just like, oh, you're just an apologist. But then they go and defend why they're an atheist. And I'll say, well, you're just an apologist. So I'm a Christian apologist. I really do think Christianity is true, and it's for many reasons. So I'm going to provide reasons. I'm going to provide logical arguments for the truth of why I think Christianity is true. And because of that, I can be called a Christian apologist. So we're going to discuss some of these reasons and these arguments that demonstrate Christianity is true, or even probably true. Now this first one is based from the argument that a guy named, this is fun to say, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. You have to say it just like that. Kind of sound like Arnold or something. I don't know. But Leibniz, let's just say he was a really smart dude. He's accredited to being a co-inventor or a co-discoverer of calculus. So really smart guy. He was a mathematician, a logician, a metaphysician, philosopher, much more than that. I think he was even a politician, I'm not sure. But he was a great guy, very smart. But I think his greatest accomplishment was in the field of apologetics. And he came up with an argument for the existence of God. One of the smartest guys to ever walk the planet, who was a Christian, came up with an argument for the existence of God that we are still discussing today. So it's often referred to as the Leibnizian Cosmological argument. It's also been called the argument from contingency. Sometimes it's just referred to as the cosmological argument, but there's other cosmological arguments out there, so I like to call it either the argument from contingency or the Leibnizian cosmological argument. Next week we'll be discussing a different cosmological argument. Well, with that in mind, let's begin by clarifying a few things. First, what's an explanation?
An answer to a question?
Answer to a question, yeah. An explanation answers the question why, or shows the reason for something. So we usually like to find explanations to things if possible, don't we? We demand explanations. We look for these explanations. We want to find these explanations. Don't you agree? Yeah, everybody agrees. Okay, yes. So with that in mind, with an explanation in mind, now let's discuss this. What is a cause? Now, go ahead.
An event that forces or initiates something else?
That would be one example of a kind of a cause. Aristotle actually distinguished between several kinds of causes. You've got a material cause, an efficient cause, all these different kinds of causes. For our sake and for our purposes today, when I discuss a cause, I'm talking about something that is going to make something else happen. Yep, so much in line with what you said, Noah. A cause is something that makes something else happen. All right, a couple more things we need to define. The word necessary. What does it mean to be necessary? Some things are necessary. And when we say that, we mean that they must be. If something exists, necessarily, it must exist. It cannot fail to exist. It can't begin to exist because at one point it would not have existed, and so it wouldn't have been necessary. So it's something that just must always exist. It cannot fail to exist. That's what we mean by something that's necessary. For an example of this, many mathematicians would say that numbers and the laws of mathematics and the laws of logic are things that exist necessarily. Now, there's a big debate if these things actually do exist. If they do exist, we would refer to these things as abstract objects. And so, just as we debate if God exists, there's a big debate on if abstract objects exist, because they would not be something you would, they're not the kind of thing you can empirically verify or test, or you can't dig up the number 7, or you don't have to look both ways before you cross the street in hopes that you don't get run over by the number 7. These things exist in abstracta, or something of that nature, for lack of a better word. But if abstract objects do actually exist, these would be the kinds of things that would exist necessarily. Now, it's not... let me back up. 2 plus 2 equals 4. That's a truth that exists necessarily. So there's no possible world that you can think of where this many things plus this many things does not equal this many things. Okay? Even in bizarro world, right? 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, even if there's a whole bunch of weird things going on. They've always, mathematical truths like that, even logic-based truths must be true in any possible world. So some things are necessary, they must be, or they must exist. All right. Now there's other things that do not exist necessarily. And if you don't exist necessarily, then you're a contingent type of thing. So we're going to distinguish between things that exist necessarily and things that exist contingently. Understanding those two concepts and what makes them different is vital. So some things are not necessary. That means they could be, or they could exist. Examples, people, right? You don't have to exist because your parents it was not necessary for your parents to get married. It was not necessary for your parents to even meet each other. Your parents could have failed to exist, right? They're contingent. Thus, you're contingent because you're contingent upon them meeting and more. So we don't want to think about that. But so other things that are contingent are trees, rocks and stars and rock stars like Chris File over here. Right? You see what I did there? And so all of these things are contingent. They do not have to exist. They could fail to exist. So they didn't have to exist in the first place, and they could stop existing. If that's true about a certain thing, then it is not necessary and it's contingent. With all those clarifications and definitions in mind, let's get to the Leibnizian cosmological argument. Here's a form of it anyway. Premise 1. Everything that exists has an explanation why it exists. Either because it must exist, it's necessary, or because something else caused it to exist. That is to say, it's contingent. So again, everything that exists has an explanation why it exists. Because it's either necessary or contingent. So something exists, its explanation is either because it exists due to a necessity of its own nature, or because it's contingent on something else. So the truth of 2 plus 2 equaling 4 is just necessarily true. It doesn't depend on anything else. But iPhones, this thing I'm looking into right now. An iPhone is a contingent type of thing. All right, so with that in mind, that's premise one. Everything that exists has an explanation. Why it exists, because it's either necessary or contingent. Premise two, the universe exists. Most people don't debate that. 3, here's a conclusion. Therefore, the universe has an explanation why it exists. Okay, because everything that exists has an explanation. It's either necessary or contingent. Step 4, the universe does not have to exist. It's contingent. And the scientific data would point to that conclusion. It is a contingent type of thing. It does not have to exist. 5, here's another conclusion. Therefore, something else caused the universe to exist. All right, that just means, hey, if the universe is contingent, it's contingent upon something. 6, if something else made the universe exist, it's God. 7, final conclusion, therefore, God exists. All right, let's just really quickly touch on that step 6 of the argument. If something else made the universe exist, it's God. That seems to jump off the page and get everybody's attention right away. And let's just explain that by showing what it's synonymous with. Okay, if something else made the universe exist, it's got to be God. Well, wait a second. People say, why jump to that conclusion? Well, it's synonymous with a couple statements. Consider this one. If God does not exist, then the universe has no explanation of its existence. Or if atheism is true, then nothing made the universe or all nature come into existence. Because, nature, if all nature is contingent upon something, whatever is nature is contingent upon must be something other than nature. Because it's incoherent to say nature is contingent upon nature. Right? We were having that discussion a little while ago. So nature must be contingent upon something other than nature, and that's just what philosophers refer to as supernatural. All right, so that's our argument. Let's go through step by step, and let me defend each step to see if the conclusions are sound and valid. See if the argument is valid, reaching sound conclusion. So, is step 1 true, or does step 1 at the very least, make more sense than its opposite? All you need for a good argument is premises that are either true or more probably true than the negation of that argument. Okay, so you don't have to prove every step is true, but just show that you've got good reason to think it's probably true. At the very least, that's what you need for a good argument. So, step 1, is it true or does it make more sense than its opposite? I think so. I'd answer yes to that. I mean, after all, look all around you. Doesn't it seem that everything that you see has an explanation of its existence? I mean, I'm seeing tables and chairs and humans. I'll get the TV screen behind me. I'm looking into a smartphone on a tripod. I can tell you explanations as to why all these things exist. So it seems that everything has an explanation. I can't think of anything that doesn't have an explanation regarding those two things. Things either exist necessarily or they're contingent upon something else. And think of it this way. Here's a good analogy that Dr. Craig offers. Imagine you're going on a hiking trip with your buddy. And let's say your buddy is a scientist and he knows all about nature. He loves to tell you about everything that you're coming across on this little hiking trip. And so you're up and you go to Colorado and you're walking in the mountains and you're looking all around. He starts giving you an explanation as to why everything exists. He tells you how everything formed and all these explanations. But then as you're walking and you're on this trail and you kind of look off into the trees and something catches your eye. And you go off the trail and you go to see what this is. Something is shining and it's kind of luminous, and you go over there and it's this sphere, some shiny sphere, and maybe you've seen the Lord of the Rings, what's that sphere called? You know what I'm talking about? Who was it? Pippin? The Hobbit Pippin that was enamored with this thing, and Gandalf, he's like, we got to wrap this up and hide it. So maybe something like that, or even just catches your attention that you're in awe of this thing. And it clearly doesn't seem to belong, with all the trees and the rocks and everything else that are in the Rocky Mountains. But your friend, you're happy that you're with your friend who can provide an explanation for all of these things. And so you're like, hey, friend, come over here. You've been explaining everything to me. Look at this translucent, luminous, mysterious, shiny ball. Tell me about this. Now, this friend of yours who's been explaining everything to you now has a different attitude. He's like, oh, well, don't worry about that thing. Come on, let's keep hiking. You're like, no, wait, you've been giving me an explanation for everything. This thing it's just really got my attention. Can you please give me an explanation of this? No, come on, let's just keep going. No, please, this is the one thing I want an explanation for. And then he says, stop worrying about it. That thing just exists inexplicably. It has no explanation of its existence. Now, come on. Would you accept that? Or would you demand an explanation? Why be so arbitrary? Why say, yeah, everything's got an explanation. I would like to tell you the explanation for everything, but that's the one thing I'm not going to give you an explanation. What? You would just wouldn't you say that just seems wrong? Well, what happens if that ball, I'm calling it the size of a volleyball, well, what if it got a little bit bigger? The size of a basketball? Wouldn't you still demand an explanation? What if it was the size of this room, roughly? Wouldn't you still demand an explanation? What if it was the size of the moon? You'd still want an explanation for that. Or the size of Jupiter, or the sun. You would still demand an explanation. Isn't that what science does? We look for explanations for things. What if it was the size of the galaxy? Would increasing the size of it mean it doesn't need an explanation anymore? What if it was the size of the universe? Just increasing the size of something doesn't mean it still doesn't have an explanation. So the point is, everything seems to demand an explanation. So I think step one is true. That everything that exists has an explanation as to why it exists. It's either necessary or contingent. So that's the question. Well, let's go to step 2 of the argument. Is step 2 true? Of course it is, unless you're not being serious. To remind everybody that it's not going through a workbook, step 2 of the argument is the universe exists. Now, some people might say the universe doesn't exist in the same way that you think it does. For example, there's some people out there that appeal to something called digital physics, or I've got friends who affirm this view called idealism. And they would say that the universe isn't really a material kind of thing like we feel like it is, and like our senses tell us it is, but that it's really based on information, and since information is not the kind of thing you can touch, then, roughly, we feel like it's made of matter, but it's not really made of matter. One way or the other, everybody all agrees that the universe is something that at least it seems like it exists, and that it's full of a whole bunch of thinking about what we at least feel like exists or that actually does exist. One way or the other, the universe exists in some form or fashion. So, with that said, nobody really doubts premise 2 of the argument. The conclusion. The first conclusion we get to is step 3. Is that true? Yes, it follows logically from steps 1 and 2. What about step 4? Oh, and by the way, the conclusion of step 3 was therefore the universe has an explanation as to why it exists. What about step 4? That is, the universe doesn't have to exist. Should we think that's true? Yes. But why think the universe, or this universe must exist? Should we think the universe is necessary? Couldn't there be something else instead of this universe? I don't want to get into it too much now because we're going to spend a lot of our time next week discussing this. But science tells us, through Big Bang cosmology, the Born-Guffel-Lankin theorem, things like that, that all natural stuff, the space-time universe, began to exist. Well, if it began to exist, then there was a state of affairs in which it did not exist. So if that's the case, then the universe doesn't seem, it can't be necessary. It can't be. And in fact, it seems, if left to our own naturalistic devices, that the universe will eventually fail to exist. At the bottom, it's not going to continue existing as it is. That's for sure. So let's see. Couldn't there be something else? Maybe a different universe with different things in it. We can imagine a universe very similar to this one, but with different kinds of matter in it. Definitely different people in it. You don't have to exist. You could fail to exist. Then we would have a different world in that sense. But we could have a different universe with different kinds of things in it. Or made of different kind of matter. Maybe different kinds of subatomic particles. Imagine this. A universe just like this one, made of the same kinds of matter, but made of a different set of subatomic particles or whatever. So it could be made of the same kinds of stuff, just a different set of the same kinds of stuff. So with that in mind, I mean, these things would lend weight to the idea that this universe is not necessary. Even, as I said, space and time don't seem to have to exist because it seems that these things, space and time, began to exist. We'll talk about that more next week. But, bottom line, why can't there be nothing at all? Why can't there be nothing instead of all of this something? Well, that at least provides very good reason, all of that together, to think that step 4 is true, or at least probably true. What about step 5? Step 5 is another conclusion that says, therefore, something else caused the universe to exist. Should we think that's true? Well, it follows logically from steps 1, 3, and 4. Let's get back to step 6. I already made a note. Let me remind you that step 6 says, if something else made the universe, all nature, time, and space, then God created the universe, all nature, time, and space. That's synonymous with, if atheism is true, then nothing made the universe. If atheism is true, then nothing caused nature, time, and space to begin existing. That's what the atheist claims, right? If atheism is true, nothing caused matter and nature and time and space to begin existing, or to exist at all. I'm going to get into next week's by using the word begin. Sorry for that confusion. But you could just say, if atheism is true, then the universe, nature, time, and space, and matter is not contingent upon anything else. All right. So yeah, let's call, what is this? This something else. Now, I said it's God. But if you don't want to use the word God, maybe that's too religious, or you don't want to jump to that conclusion yet. Let's just call this thing that the universe is contingent upon G. So just write in a capital G there in your workbook. Let's call this something G. What can we say about G? Now, I'll just know. I've already said it's God. But even if there's some people that are so committed to their atheism, they don't have any arguments that atheism is true, that God does not exist. They just say they have a lack of belief in God. And that's really agnosticism. If push comes to shove, that's really agnosticism. But if somebody is committed to their belief, and to this, blindly, let's call it a blind faith. If somebody has a blind faith that atheism is true, or even probably true, but they're committed to being an atheist or an agnostic, one might see where this argument is going. And they don't want it to be true. Usually because that means that there'd be an objective morality that their life isn't lining up with. That's my experience anyway. Why so many my friends who are atheists, they don't want Christianity to be true because that means they're going to have to change the way they think and act, because that brings objective moral values and obligations. That exposes that that's a reality. We're going to discuss that, I think, in 2 weeks. So I digress. But one might see where this argument is going, and that it's pointing to God heavily at this point, and they might change their tune. From saying, yeah, everything that does exist has an explanation. It either exists necessarily or contingently. And they say, wait. That's true of everything except for the universe. It's true of everything except for nature, time, and space. And you're like, well, why? Because that's the one thing they don't want to have an explanation. Because they see, if it does have an explanation, it's got to be God. And then if God exists, that changes everything. So, this is what Dr. Craig calls the taxicab fallacy. It's taxicab fallaciousness. If somebody says, yeah, everything, your buddy that you're on that hike with, who's a scientist, and he's giving you explanations to everything, and he says, yeah, everything's got an explanation, I'm going to find that explanation, and oh, wait a second, here's the one thing that I don't want to have an explanation, because if it has an explanation, then that changes my life. And I don't want my life to change. That's my experience anyway. So, here's the deal. If you jump out of the taxi cab before it arrives at its logical destination, then you've committed the taxi cab fallacy. So, let's get back to the workbook here. It says, wait, not so fast. From step 1, G, whatever G is, also needs an explanation. So, maybe G also needs a cause. Well, what can we call that? How about G2? But doesn't G2 also need a cause? Let's call that G3. But what about G3? Okay, G4 and G5. And then, like a G6, you have another... Oh, sorry about that. Okay. But can you keep doing that forever? No, that would lead to an incoherence of an infinite regress. And it's simpler to just stop at G. All right? So, and plus, if we wanted to appeal to an infinite regress, then nothing would really get explained. It's like you can't borrow money forever. Don't tell that to our government. But that's not going to work out good if you think that you can keep borrowing money forever. All right, well, since we have to stop somewhere, let's just stop at G. It's simpler, and it really is in line with what Aristotle concluded about the unmoved mover. So G does not have a cause, but this means that G, right? This means that G is not contingent upon anything, whatever G is. But if G is not contingent upon anything, then G is what? Necessary. Now, Brian, we were talking earlier. If something exists necessarily, is it even incoherent to say, well, what caused this necessary thing to exist?
That'd be incoherent.
That's an incoherent question. Right? That's like, what is this necessary thing contingent upon? So that question that our friend asked you is an incoherent question. It's meaningless. So you can have that conversation with him. All right. Let's go to page 16 and discuss some rational inferences. All right, because G caused or made the universe, it can't be in the universe. Let's define universe. The universe is all of space and matter and time, and I'll say nature. Okay, you got some people that want to define nature differently. Well, look, did I skip a page or something? Page 16.
Oh, okay.
All right. I define science as the study of nature. So anything that science could possibly, not that we have to have it all figured out right now, but anything that, in essence, that science could possibly test or discover, then that is what I define as nature. So when I say that, when I discuss naturalism, if somebody's a naturalist, unless I hear you define your if I hear you define being a naturalist differently, I assume that you think only the kinds of things that can be scientifically tested or discovered exist. Some people will disagree with that definition, but that's how I use it. You're free to disagree, but then define your terms for me. So, because G caused or made the universe, it can't be in the universe. And again, the universe is all nature, the space-time universe, and all of its contents. That would be matter, energy, everything like that. So, if that's the case, G, whatever G is, the cause of all nature, the cause of all space, matter, and time, if G, whatever it is, caused all of that, then G must be, 1, immaterial, not made of matter. Another word for that is spirit, but call it what you will. Some people don't like that word because of its religious connotations. But so let's just call it immaterial. 2, whatever caused the space-time universe cannot be in space. And 3, whatever caused the space-time universe cannot be in time. At least logically prior to creating time. Well, we might talk about that more next week. Whatever G is, G must be very powerful, extremely powerful, enormously powerful. Because I can't think of anything that requires more power than causing a universe. We're going to discuss that more next week too. I think we have an even better reason to think this. But here's the question. I was giving a lecture in Miami at Florida University, or Florida International University, a couple springs ago. And one question from the crowd was this. Well, okay, you've shown that there has to be a creator of the universe, but why is there only just one? Why can't we have multiple creators, maybe a team of these supernatural beings working on the universe together? Well, the question is G, whatever G is, one thing or many things? Well, when you consider the principle of Occam's razor, that razor slices away all these other things. It's simpler to believe in G when considering Occam's razor. Why multiply causes needlessly when one is enough? So the principle of Occam's razor states that you should not needlessly add more causes. Or if one explanation is sufficient, you don't need to keep providing others. Did a bad job of explaining that probably. That's the bottom line when it comes to Occam's razor. So this argument, in conjunction with Occam's razor, would point towards just one thing that the universe is contingent upon. So it's simpler to believe that G is just one thing, and we have no reason to think G is many more things, especially since one is already enough. So, with all of this, we've seen that there is a thing, which we call G, that made the universe. Nothing made G. That'd be an incoherent question to ask what made G or what G is contingent upon. G must exist because it's necessary. G is not in the universe. G is immaterial. G is not in space. G is not in time. And G is very powerful. We've come to these conclusions just through using logic. We haven't touched any Bible or any other spiritual book, right? Just thinking logically. And we've seen that G, something called G, is necessary and the universe is contingent upon it. Let's go. You guys got time to go through 2 pages? Anybody in a hurry? What about everybody in Facebook world? You guys are all good? Okay. We'll try to go a little bit faster through these. We're going to show now that G, whatever G is a person. All right, so this is lesson 2 on the top of page 17. All right, refresh our memories. We logically proved. All right, when I say proved, I mean logically. All right, and through logical deduction. All right. So we logically prove that there is a thing which we call G, which made the universe and nothing made G. G must exist. G is not in the universe. It's immaterial, not in space, not in time. G is very powerful. Now, there are two ways to logically prove that G is a person. And this is very exciting. So let's look at our different options here. We've got 4 options to put on the table to consider. All right, 1. The only things we can think of that are both immaterial and cause things to happen are souls, or spirits, or ghosts, or minds. Maybe they're all the same thing. I think that's probably the case. I like to describe all of these things that I just said. You know, if these things exist, that's another question. I will make arguments for that. But if these things exist, souls, spirits, ghosts, or minds, what have you, these are all examples of immaterial thinking things. Okay, things that are not composed of matter, that would exist and have thoughts and act upon their thoughts. They're immaterial thinking things. Now these things, even though I'm not stating they must exist right now, I do have deductive arguments for the existence of the soul. That's for a later date. See the Freethinking argument. But at the very least, even for the skeptic, the atheist, the naturalist, whatever, at the very least, these things seem possible, that they could possibly exist. For example, consider the millions upon millions and millions of near-death, out-of-body experiences that we have just in America, let alone the rest of the world, right? But we get these all the time. Now, even if these are false, is it possible that even one of them is true? I mean, it seems to me that I can conceive of myself existing apart from my body. And these near-death experiences that people have would provide testimonial support showing that that's at least possible, even if it's false. Do you see what I'm saying? Even if it's not true that people actually can exist apart from their bodies and look down on their bodies without the use of their eyes, it seems possible. So, as soon as somebody, even if they don't think it's true, but they say it's possible, then there's something true of you that's not true of your body and brain. After all, it's possible for you to exist apart from your body and brain, but it's not possible for your body and brain to exist apart from the body and brain. So there would be something true of you that is possible for you to exist apart from your body and brain, even if it's false. But that means that you're not your body and brain, because you've got a different property. This is based on the law of identity. I've got an article on it on my website if you'd like to read more about that. I can't remember what it's called right now, but just something about the soul and the law of identity, probably. Anyway, here's the thing. Those things seem possible, these immaterial thinking things, but souls, spirits, ghosts, minds, what have you, are all examples of persons. Not to be confused with a human, but a personal thing. A person. So if that's the case, then G is a person. Now let me just say this. Philosophers over the centuries can only think of 2 kinds of things that could possibly exist apart from the universe. Nature, time, space, and matter. Okay? Only 2 kinds of things. One is abstract objects that we discussed earlier, and 2 is unembodied minds like souls. There's debate if either of those things exist. But those are the only 2 kinds of things that could possibly exist apart from nature, time, and space. But could an abstract object cause the universe? No, because by definition, abstract objects, as Dr. Craig says, are causally effete. I said it earlier, you don't have to look both ways when crossing the street in hopes that you don't get run over by the number 7. Because abstract objects, if they exist, don't cause things like physical things do. Or like minds do. Alright? Minds, if they exist, would be the kind of things that could cause things to happen. So, it seems that the inference to the best explanation, what caused the universe, is a mind, not something abstract. All right, so that's one option. You've got a person here. Now, we can ask, well, why did G cause the universe to exist? Well, there's only 4 answers, and I need to back up. I said these are the 4 things we're going to survey here. I got ahead of myself. All right, there's 4 possible answers to this question. Why would G cause the universe to exist? And all of these explanations are not created equal. Number 1, there's no reason at all G made the universe. It just did, and that's it. Well, if that's your response, I'm going to have to say that's a bad answer. Because, well, remember, don't we usually like to find explanations to things? We want explanations. We demand explanations. And we would never use this answer for anything else in life. Scientists would not accept this response in the lab or anywhere else. So why just say this is the one thing that doesn't have an explanation just because you don't want it to be true, that something called G exists? That's your first option. There's no reason at all. The second, is to the question, why did G cause the universe to exist, is that something else made G cause the universe to exist. So let's call this thing G2. So then the question is raised, why did G2 make G do it? Why did G2 cause G to cause the universe? It's like falling dominoes. But then the question is raised, well, maybe something else made G2 do it. You got G3, G4, G5, and like a G6. Okay, so we can't keep doing that forever. That's an infinite regress. So, since we got to stop somewhere, we stop at G. So we can't use this answer because, bottom line, the cause of the cause would always be the cause. And so you eventually get to the ultimate G one way or the other. What about this? The third option. Why did G cause the universe? Well, G had to cause the universe. Well, think about that. Say that it was necessary for G to cause the universe. Well, we learned that G must exist necessarily, or has to exist. So if G, whatever G is, also had to make the universe, that was necessary for G to make the universe, then this universe has to exist also, necessarily and eternally. In fact, I debated a physicist once to avoid G's existence, said that the universe exists timelessly and without beginning, in an eternal, changeless state, where time is an illusion. But he said that the universe just exists without beginning in a frozen static state and exists necessarily. And I said, so you're opposed to the idea of the existence of the G because you don't think that anything like God could exist necessarily, eternally, and without beginning, but you're saying the universe and all of its contents do, including you. So in order to avoid the eternal God, he had to affirm that he was eternal himself. This is a real conversation I had. But step 4 of our argument says that this is false, right? Step 4 is the universe doesn't have to exist. And this is one of the things that I was having this conversation, this is one of the things we were discussing in that conversation I just referenced. And he doesn't like all the scientific evidence that shows the universe began to exist, but that's the topic of next week. Finally, what's the last option for why did G, whatever G is, cause the universe? Well, it could just be this, that G chose to do it. I think that's the best answer. Why? Because free choice explains itself, and you don't need to keep on explaining that. But what kinds of things choose things? At least freely. Persons. So we've got two reasons here to think that G is a person. One, because abstract objects don't cause things, and the only other thing that could be immaterial and cause things that we can think of, feel free to add to the table of possibilities here, but the only other thing that can be immaterial and cause something to exist, if it exists or not, is an immaterial, unembodied mind, an immaterial thinking thing. So that's one reason, because only persons are thinking things. And here, we've got reason to think that this thinking thing has free will and can freely choose to cause the universe or not. And I think we even have better reason to think this after next week's cosmological argument. But only persons are thinking things that can freely choose to do things. So we have two reasons to think that that which the universe is contingent upon is a personal being. So G is a person. G, whatever G is probably pretty smart to cause all the complicated things in the universe, all the kinds of things that scientists try to figure out. So the question is this: have you heard, talking to a bunch of youth pastors in the room, have you heard of someone like G before? Yeah, surprise, surprise, it's God. So is step 6 true? Yes. And finally, is step 7 true? Yes. So through logical reasoning, we have proven, logically speaking, that God does exist. And these are the same laws of logic that science assumes to be true before the scientist even starts the scientific method or enters the lab. With that said, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made. John 1:3. Let's praise him. Have a great day.
Amen.
We can't stop the recording. No, it's awkward.